It's Game Boy World, and this, I'm afraid, is Hyper Lode Runner. It's September 1989, and already we have not only the second Western game for Game Boy, but the third PC conversion. Like Shanghai, Hyper Lode Runner got its start in the West, but became something of a fixture on Japanese consoles. However, the original Lode Runner creator, Doug Smith, had nothing to do with this version of the game. Instead, it comes to us courtesy of famous ghost development house Tosei, and therein the tragedy lies. Hyper Lode Runner isn't terrible, but that's because the underlying concept is so strong. However, it is a terrible adaptation of that concept. Hyper Lode Runner may well be the most inept and graceless Lode Runner conversion ever. The fundamental design remains the same as ever. You control a miner gathering gold from a maze guarded by deadly robots. You have no weapons save the ability to drill into the ground. The pit you create will eventually seal up, so if you trap a robot and it doesn't escape in time, the pit will seal over it and destroy it. The same goes for you as well though, and you can very easily trap yourself with your own abilities. The task at hand for each maze is simply to survive long enough to collect all the gold present and escape. Simple and timeless, right? Not so here. Hyper Lode Runner allows you to play any of its first 15 stages without the need for a password, and all 15 of those levels feel like they were taken from the advanced back half of the PC original. The problem comes from the utter lack of a learning curve. Lode Runner can be a challenging, fast-paced game, but other versions always had the decency to ease you into the complexity of the experience. In this case, right from the outset, you're up against multiple enemies and some dizzyingly complex layouts. While I'm no fan of games that lean on overt tutorials to convey their rules to players, Hyper Lode Runner takes it a little too far in the other direction. It doesn't so much toss newcomers into the pool and expect them to learn to swim, as it does wrap them in chains, seal them in a lead box, and drop them into an ocean trench somewhere. I suspect the hyper in this title is meant to denote that this is more of an expert-level challenge intended for Lode Runner enthusiasts, veteran players, maintaining the tradition of such classics as faster, harder, more challenging Qbert, basically. The Game Boy may seem an unlikely home for a game designed for Lode Runner veterans, but keep in mind that like Spelunker and Wizardry, Lode Runner is one of those Western franchises that Japan took a shine to and built on much more vigorously than in its point of origin. You could probably thank the Famicom boom for this. Hudson's NES conversion of Lode Runner was one of the system's first third-party games, released in July 1984. And as such, it benefited from the scarcity of content available for the system once it began to properly take off. Lode Runner sold something like 1.5 million copies on Famicom. It did so well that creator Doug Smith pegs the series as having a roughly 4-to-1 sales ratio in Japan versus the West. A few years after Hudson's version, Irem and Tamtex followed up on it with Super Lode Runner and Super Lode Runner 2. Hyper Lode Runner then makes sense as the next logical evolution beyond Super Lode Runner, but all that changing hands from developer to developer didn't do the series any favors. Hyper Lode Runner builds on the series' Famicom traditions established by other developers, but not necessarily in a good way. Besides dropping players right into the deep end and then holding them underwater as they flailed desperately before expiring, Hyper Lode Runner also maintains the tradition that Hudson established of making the game look super cute. Doug Smith's original versions of Lode Runner for Apple II and similar microcomputers used tiny little stickman graphics. Nothing terribly inspiring, but highly functional. Those old computer versions allow you to take in a lot of action all at once and plan your moves with that information. The NES version, however, could fit less information on screen at once because it presented its world with big cartoonish sprites. But Hudson designed its mazes around this factor and implemented only a single direction of scrolling in any given stage. Hyper Lode Runner maintains this general visual style, but it's on a system with such low resolution compared to the NES that players only have a small window into the action at a time. Tosei was at least kind enough to scale down the character sprites of the enemies so that you get a bigger view than you might if they'd used NES-style sprites. But still, on the Game Boy's screen, it feels terribly cramped. There's a lot of trial and error and guesswork involved, things that weren't present in the original version of the game, and not even so much in the NES version. Tracking and predicting enemy movements is practically impossible because if you can see them, it's probably too late to avoid them. In order to cope with Hyper Lode Runner, you need an uncanny grasp of enemy behavior and timing, not to mention a keen memory for the complex maze of ladders and platforms that comprise each level. This is an expert level game from an era when expert level meant unreasonably hard. I will say this for Bandai though, they did demonstrate commendable faith in their player base. This clearly plays not as a game designed for the little kids who are the ostensible target audience for Game Boy, but rather for the system's older, more seasoned audience. That being said, I'm not sure who the level editor feature was meant for. Hyper Lode Runner allows you to design your own stages, but lacking any sort of battery backup or a password system complex enough to record your creations, there seems to be an expectation of putting forward a ton of work that will vanish the instant you shut the system down. Again, this is likely inspired by Hudson's Lode Runner, which also had a level editor mode and no battery backup to preserve it. But that version of the game supported the Famicom data recorder, so you could record level creations and then swap them by trading tapes with your friends. Here though, no such peripheral existed for Game Boy. And so, like the rest of Hyper Lode Runner, the level editor seems like an interesting idea undermined by poor implementation. And so what should by all rights be a timeless classic for Game Boy's library feels sloppily assembled and ultimately best forgotten. For more wretched disappointments to come, keep reading and watching GameBoyWorld.com.